How Dallas Mayor Turned the Tide on Crime. The tribulations that have swept America's big cities over the past few years have been nearly biblical in scale: a pandemic, racial strife, rising homelessness, a surge in violent crime. Which is why municipal elections across the map, in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles and Philadelphia, among others, have been especially contentious and ideological. Dallas, however, stands as an exception. Last month, Democratic Mayor Eric Johnson, 47, cruised unopposed to a second term, marking the first time that had happened here since 1967. The last mayor to be re-elected without an opponent was a towering figure in city history whose name, by weird coincidence, was Eric Johnson. In a recent poll by the Garen-Hart-Young Research Group, Johnson's approval rating stood at a gravity-defying 77%, with 54% saying their city is headed in the right direction. Johnson's is a remarkable personal story, a precocious kid from a rough West Dallas neighborhood whose drive and intelligence so impressed his first-grade teacher that she helped wangle a scholarship for him at an elite private school, where he thrived. He went on to earn 3 Ivy League degrees. Returning home, he served nearly a decade in the State House of Representatives as a progressive Democrat, known for championing civil rights. He led a successful campaign to remove an offensive and historically inaccurate plaque asserting that the Civil War was not a rebellion, nor was its underlying cause to sustain slavery from the wall near his office in the state capitol. Johnson was expected to run for Congress at some point, but surprised pretty much everyone by making a late entry instead into a 9-candidate, nonpartisan mayoral race in 2019. With support from the city's powerful business community, notably billionaire oilman and major Republican donor Ray Hunt, who was so dazzled by Johnson the first time they met that he decided on the spot to back him, he beat a veteran city council member in the runoff. Yet in his early days as mayor, few would have predicted that Johnson would have a glide path to re-election. His political skills were not as well honed as you might like, says Southern Methodist University political scientist Cal Gilson. His first 2 years were very rocky. He clashed with members of the city council, and even took the highly unorthodox step of endorsing some of their opponents in the 2021 election. The city's second black mayor, he waged a campaign to fire the city's first black female police chief, Renee Hall, who on her way out pronounced herself offended and exhausted by Johnson's attacks. His battles with city manager T.C. Broadnax, whose office, under Dallas' system of government, holds more day-to-day governing power than the mayor's, were epic. What explains Johnson's success amid all this was one issue: his unbending stance on crime. When Johnson took office, violent crime was rising in Dallas to levels not seen since the 1990s. And then it got even worse once the pandemic hit, Johnson told me. I think it actually required a slightly different skill set than what is normally required. And that skill set really revolves mostly around a certain amount of conviction around some principles and being willing to hold the line on some things and withstand some direct hits politically. Those political hits came during the racial reckoning that followed the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis in 2020. As in other cities, there were calls in Dallas to defund the police, and the city council was considering trimming the budget by cutting police overtime by $7 million. Johnson not only opposed the idea but made a counterproposal to boost the number of officers on the street, and to pay for it by reducing what he called the bloated salaries of the highest-paid city officials instead. #defund bureaucracy, he tweeted. Black Lives Matter protesters marched on his house multiple times. And the city council resoundingly voted down his salary cut proposal. Still, Johnson believes he made his point. The defund the police movement, despite what people in some cases now want to pretend like was happening at the time, there are people now who want to pretend like that wasn't actually a real thing. It was a very real thing, he told me. And if we're just being honest about it, my fellow mayors, a lot of them across the country bowed to that political pressure and decided to make across-the-board cuts to their police departments. Johnson also demanded a more aggressive strategy for combating violent crime, which was delivered by his new police chief, Eddie Garcia, who took over the department in early 2021. Parts of it involved tactics such as deploying violence interrupters to resolve street-level conflicts and guide those who need them to social services, and cleaning up blighted areas, such as trash-filled vacant lots and dilapidated buildings, where crime can breed. The plan that Garcia developed, working with criminologists at the University of Texas at San Antonio, also refocused policing in Dallas on hotspots. They divided the city into 101,000 microgrids, areas roughly the size of 2 football fields side by side, and discovered that crime was heavily concentrated in relatively few, an apartment complex here or a nightclub parking lot there. Just 50 of these hot spots accounted for almost 10% of violent street crime in Dallas. These high-risk areas were where the department sent police cars to sit with their emergency lights on or where 10-officer crime response teams were dispatched. This approach can be polarizing, given that hot spots tend to be in communities of color. But statistics suggest it is working. Of the nation's largest cities, Dallas appears to be the only one to buck the trend of rising crime. In each of the past 2 years, statistics for murders, rapes, and aggravated assaults have gone down. Skeptics will note that crime numbers are volatile, and that different jurisdictions collect them differently, making comparisons across cities imprecise. And in the early months of this year, the tally in one category, homicides, has ticked up again in Dallas. But Johnson, who obsesses about data, says he is confident that the trend is real, and that it is holding. "I'm either the luckiest mayor in the United States," he said, "or this stuff actually works." How Dallas mayor turned the tide on crime. The tribulations that have swept America's big cities over the past few years have been nearly biblical in scale: a pandemic, racial strife, rising homelessness, a surge in violent crime. Which is why municipal elections across the map, in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Philadelphia, among others, have been especially contentious and ideological. Dallas, however, ruling on redistricting, the Supreme Court again repudiates colorblind law. In a 2006 case about racial calculations in redistricting, Chief Justice John G. Roberts Jr. wrote, "It is a sordid business, this divvying us up by race." Now he has written the opinion for a divided 5-4 Supreme Court holding that Alabama's redistricting after the 2020 census did not do enough divvying. Section 2 of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, as amended in 1982, proscribes any voting arrangement that results in a denial or abridgment of the right of any citizen to vote on account of race. Courts, prodded by groups intent on maximizing race-conscious policies and minimizing colorblindness as a social aspiration, have radically rewritten this. They have changed the right to vote into an entitlement to arrangements that make likely particular election results. This week, the Supreme Court preserved this perversion of the law. It affirmed that the VRA protects black voters against the dilution of their power to achieve their preferred, presumably racial, election outcomes. The court said black